and welcome to the Ghosts and Folklore podcast. I'm Mark Rees, and on each episode, I investigate a different, weird, and wonderful subject. And on this episode, we are going to explore a terrifying supernatural sound, a ghostly wail that might be heard drifting on a cold winter's night, floating on the icy breeze, a sound that can only mean one thing to those who hear it, for this is a death omen, and to hear this sound means that death is nigh. So, a nice, cheerful subject. And so, to begin at the beginning. And this episode is dedicated to the spine-chilling spectre known as the Cyhyraeth. Cyhyraeth, which is spelt Cyhyraeth, Cyhyraeth, which is a Welsh death omen, a good old death omen that is heard rather than seen. And I've spoken a lot about death omens on this podcast over the years, but if you're unfamiliar with a death omen, very briefly, they are supernatural signs, supernatural omens that death is coming, either for the person who encounters them or for somebody they know or somebody else in the area. So a death omen is bad news for at least one person and possibly multiple people, because the nature of the death omen does give some clues as to who exactly is going to die and also how many. For example, one of the most popular death omens in Welsh folklore is the corpse candle, y canwyll corff, which appears like a glowing ball of light, hence the name. And the size and the shape and the speed and the colour of this corpse candle offers up some hints as to who is going to die. So the bigger the light, the older the person may be, and the more lights there are, the more people that are going to die. Now, a death omen, like the corpse candle, is seen when it's encountered. It is seen rather than heard, floating around in the dark forests at night. But there are death omens for different senses. Maybe you can feel them, smell them, taste them, or in this case, hear them. Actually, I'm not sure about tasting them. I might have just made that one up. I'll have to double check that one. Although Welsh folklore is quite weird, so I wouldn't be surprised if there is a death omen you can taste. But you can certainly see them, as is the case with the corpse candle, and you can certainly hear them. Otherwise, this would be a very short episode, as is the case with the Cyhyraeth. And for a description of the Cyhyraeth, we can turn to a 19th century folklorist who tells us that it is a particularly loud, groaning spirit that has long been heard making a terrifying noise along the Glamorganshire coast. So from Aberthaw to Porthcawl and beyond, it can be heard wailing, drifting slowly towards the shore, towards the terrified landlubbers standing on the sand. This sound, this death omen, is coming towards them from far out at sea, from some distant, dark place in the ocean. And this noise does work a lot like the waves themselves. You could call them sound waves in a way if you wanted to make a bad pun, because these moaning sounds go up and then back down in volume. They increase and they decrease in volume with the ebb of the tide. So as the waves go up, the volume goes up. As the waves come down, the volume comes down. And it is in this way that the sound creeps up on its victims. It lulls them into a false sense of security, the way it keeps going up and down, appearing and disappearing. Because at first you might think, what is that strange sound? But then it fades away and you think, it was nothing. But wait, it's back. There's that strange sound again. Oh, and it's gone again. And it goes up and down until all of a sudden, bang, it surprises you. It surprises its victim with a deafening cry from out of nowhere. And if one death omen wasn't bad enough, one loud banging sound creeping up on you wasn't enough, well, I did mention the corpse candles just now, and the Cyhyraeth, we are told, are occasionally accompanied by a number of these corpse candles bobbing on the waves, these sinister lights that hover on the water and foreshadow a wreck. And if you hear the Cyhyraeth scream wailing at the same time, this is a warning that the bodies will soon be washed ashore, which is a particularly grim image to conjure in your mind. But the corpse candles themselves, they say there's going to be a wreck. And then the Cyhyraeth tells you that the bodies will also be washed ashore soon afterwards. Now that is the Cyhyraeth at sea. The Cyhyraeth that crashes to shore on the waves. And if you're thinking, well, that's fine because I live in a nice big city and I haven't seen the sea in years, I'm perfectly safe, thank you very much. Well, it just so happens the Cyhyraeth is just as deadly inland, if not more deadly than it is at sea, because we are told that on land it rattles windows and opens doors as it moans through the empty streets at night. So inland, the Cyhyraeth rattles windows, opens doors as it moans through the empty streets at night. So it's worth remembering that the next time you are out and about walking after dark, maybe you're walking home from the pub late at night, or rushing about to do that last minute Christmas shopping, or whatever people do when they're out and about after dark at this time of year. If a wind rushes past you, if it rattles the windows, if it opens doors, and if it's moaning through the empty streets at night, maybe, just maybe, the Cyhyraeth is letting you know that it is just around the corner. And if you're feeling quite smug about now, thinking, well, I don't live by the sea, and I don't go walking around lonely streets at night after dark either, well, it turns out the Cyhyraeth can also pay you a house visit. Yes, it can come directly to your home, and you will know if it's visited your property because, at the risk of repeating myself again, but if your windows are rattling and your doors are opening, then maybe your house is a bit drafty. Maybe all you need are some good draft excluders. Maybe you've got a poltergeist, but I've got enough episodes about poltergeists without shoehorning them into this one. Maybe you've got both. Maybe it's a drafty house with a poltergeist, but maybe the Cyhyraeth has paid you a visit. Because if the Cyhyraeth visits your home specifically, if it targets your house, that means very, very bad news for at least one inmate of the property. But this is bigger than other warnings because it goes beyond a single person. In fact, it goes beyond a household. This could be a warning of an epidemic on the way. Not only could it be a warning that every single person in the house is in danger, but beyond that, every single person in the nearby area, everyone in your parish could be in trouble if the Cyhyraeth pays you a house call. And for an example of the Cyhyraeth at work in a bustling town or city, we can turn to Cardiff, to the capital of Wales, where the Cyhyraeth is said to be active not in the streets, but in the grounds of a church where, according to one account, a boy heard a sobbing coming from the graveyard, and that in itself should have been a sign. Sobbing coming from a graveyard of St. Mellon's Parish Church, a wonderfully atmospheric church. And this boy was out and about running an errand at the time, heading past St. Mellon's Parish Church, and decided to go into the graveyard and investigate this crying sound. But there was a problem, because he couldn't pinpoint where this noise was coming from. It was in the general direction of the graveyard somewhere, and he headed towards one of the graves where this noise seemed to be emanating from. But as he reached it, the sound seemed to flit from that location to another part of the graveyard. So the boy again follows the sound in the direction of the crying, but after arriving, this sound once more hops away to some other part of the graveyard. This crying sound seems to be leading him on quite a chase around the graves. Now finally, on the third and final spot, he does catch up with this sound, but cannot find the source of the wailing sound. It's just there, some disembodied crying in a particular spot in the graveyard. Now, time went by, and sometime after these events, a funeral was taking place at the graveyard, and a coffin was brought to be placed in the ground. And they carried it to the plot that had been dug up and designated for this poor soul, only to discover, when they arrived, that somebody else had claimed it. Somebody else's body was already in that plot of ground. Somebody had stolen their final resting place. Now, luckily, this must have been back in the days when there was plenty of space in graveyards. Nowadays, by all accounts, space in graveyards is at a premium. People are being forced to share graves because there's just not enough space left in the world. But back then, there was an alternative. There was a second, freshly dug grave they could use instead. And so they carried the coffin to this second location, only to discover, can you believe it, it was taken as well. Now, it sounds like for some reason there was a rush on burials in this part of Cardiff. At this particular time, the graves were being filled left, right, and centre. And in this case, they had no choice but to move on again. They had to go and find a third plot in which to lay him down to rest. Slightly off the beaten track, slightly out of the way, but at least this time it was empty. Well, if they were quick, blink and you might miss it, blink, and somebody else might throw a coffin in. But nevertheless, they had found somewhere they could give this soul a proper, respectful burial, and they were laid to rest. And the reason I'm telling you all of this is because this is the spot, exactly the same spot, where the boy had heard that crying coming to a halt. And the thinking is that the sound that was heard moving around the graveyard was the death omen, was the Cyhyraeth, acting in a very similar way to another death omen, to a phantom funeral, in which a ghostly funeral is seen playing out a funeral before the real thing happens. And that was the case here. It revealed the path the sobbing mourners would have taken around the graveyard in search of an empty plot. So in this case, it wasn't the Cyhyraeth itself maybe doing the crying, rather it was foreshadowing the sobbing that the friends and family of the poorly recently deceased would have been making, walking around this graveyard, getting increasingly tired, carrying this coffin about. Now, while it wasn't seen by the boy himself, a spirit has been reportedly seen hovering in this graveyard, which may or may not be connected to the Cyhyraeth reports. And according to one witness, the spirit was seen sitting upon the old stone cross which stands on the hillside near the church. The old stone cross which stands on the hillside near the church. So, anyone walking past St. Mellon's Church at night, or day even, keep an eye out for this spot, and as well, of course, keep your ears peeled for any crying sounds. Now, moving on to one of my favourite folklorists, if not my favourite folklorist of all time, someone who I've mentioned many, many times on this podcast, but not for a while actually, and that is good old Wirt Sykes. Wirt Sykes, the American, the New Yorker, who came to Wales and chronicled the great Welsh folklore and ghost stories in the 19th century. And Sykes wrote how one David Prosser of Llanybydder in Carmarthenshire heard the Cyhyraeth before a funeral, which isn't that uncommon, as we've just heard with the boy. That's what they do. They pop up, they warn you, they scare you maybe before a funeral, and they let you know what is coming. But in this case, it wasn't just some wailing or crying like we hear in other reports. Rather, in this case, it pronounced what could be described as words. And bear with me on this one, this is going to test my pronunciation skills to the limit. But Sykes tells us that Prosser heard some kind of strange voice saying Woolach, Woolach, which is Woolach twice, Wulach, which I am assuming is pronounced in that way in the Welsh way. I mean, maybe it's Wulach. I don't know. I've never said it before. I imagine I'll never say it again. Well, unless I'm hiding in a graveyard in Carmarthenshire, maybe, and I fancy playing a practical joke. But if anyone does hear a disembodied voice saying Wulach or Wulach in a graveyard, it's probably best to make a run for it, and then afterwards drop me a message and let me know exactly how they pronounced that word. Now, according to Sykes again, this crying spirit, as he describes it, this crying spirit especially affected the 12 parishes which lie on the southeast side of the River Towy. So we're heading towards West Wales, where, some time past, back in the good old days, this moaning sound would be heard for the death of every person in that part of the country. It also sounded before the death of persons who were born in these parishes but died elsewhere. So there's lots of nice little details there. Firstly, the Cyhyraeth, according to Sykes, seems to be particularly focused on the west of Wales. Of course, not exclusively, because our earlier accounts from the Glamorganshire coast and from the city of Cardiff are both heading towards the east, but there seems to be a heck of a lot of them in the west as well, according to Sykes, where they would warn people before a funeral, and even better, I mean, this is quite handy back in the days before modern communication, they would even tell you if somebody from that area died while they were away. So if one of your friends or family decides to emigrate off to the New World, to the Americas or to down under, somewhere to make their fortune, then at least you know, I mean, you won't know how much money they made, but you will know when they're about to breathe their final breath. You will hear some kind of sobbing noise. You might even hear someone shouting Wulach at you in West Wales to signify that person who said goodbye to Wales will soon be saying goodbye to the world as the end is nigh. And he continues by saying, sometimes the voice was heard long before death, but not longer than a quarter of a year. So there's roughly a 3-month time limit on these warnings, on these death omens. So if you do hear one, maybe you're not going to drop dead tomorrow, but I certainly wouldn't be planning anything important for a year later. And he continues by saying that so common was it in the district named, so in this area in the west of Wales, so common was the Cyhyraeth that among the people there is a familiar form of reproach. If people were making too much of a noise, if the adults were making too much of a racket, if the children were bawling their heads off, the frustrated people sick of all that noise were heard to say, "Or Cyhyraeth," which is a wonderfully Welsh way of saying, well, in this case, it effectively means shut your face. Or Cyhyraeth. It's like calling them a screaming banshee, say, or it's a more polite, a more folkloric way of saying shut your face. If you want to use that, it works every time, so I'm told. Or Cyhyraeth. And finally, to wrap up this episode, and you might be asking at this point, why, oh why, was this particular part of Wales, according to Sykes, susceptible to the Cyhyraeth's wailing? What was so special about West Wales that attracted these death omens? Well, we are told a reason why the Cyhyraeth was more often heard was thought to be that Non, and that's N-O-N, Non, the mother of Saint David, who, of course, is the patron saint of Wales, the most important saint in Wales, lived in these parts, where there is a village named in her honour, Llan-non. So the village of Llan-non, named after Non, the mother of Saint David, and which means the Church of Non. If you've ever wondered why there are so many places in Wales that starts with Llan, it's because Llan means church of, or church area, or churchyard, but it all harks back to that deep Christian roots, which really is at the heart of so much of Welsh culture, Welsh folklore, Welsh ghost stories, as with this episode, and as well Welsh place names, such as Llan-non, back to Non, the mother of Saint David. That is the reason we are told the Cyhyraeth is so popular in this part of the world, and there is also Non's holy well there that you can visit that I think I spoke about on a previous episode, but it's a great place to go on All Souls Day, by all accounts, just after Halloween, to wash your eyes with that holy water to keep them in perfect condition. Just cross your fingers and hope you don't hear anyone shouting Wallach in your ear at the same time. And on that cautionary note, we've reached the end of another episode of the Ghosts and Folklore podcast. If you enjoyed this episode and you haven't already, please consider pressing the subscribe button, especially because the next episode is not only the Christmas episode, the December episode, it's also episode 150. And I should probably do something special to mark that. So watch this space. I am sure I will conjure something. I'm sure the Tylwyth Teg will help me conjure up something extra special for the Christmas episode, for episode 150. So you don't want to miss that one. If you really enjoyed this episode, you can support it by rating it, reviewing it, telling all your friends about it. That won't cost you a penny. And if you absolutely loved the podcast so much that you can't live without it, then you can treat me to a coffee via my website, which is always very, very much appreciated and goes towards keeping this thing going each episode. If you'd like more Ghosts and Folklore, you can follow me on social media, including all of those fancy new social media sites people are using nowadays. I've signed up to all of them, and we'll see how the social media wars play out, but whatever your platform of choice is, there's a good chance I'll be there. And as well as this podcast, I've also written a number of books about similar weird and wonderful subjects, which are available from all good bookshops offline and on, and a number of those bookshops do have signed copies at the moment. I've been out and about promoting recently, and I should add that as Christmas is looming, they do make lovely presents for your loved one. Just think how pleased they'll be waking up on December the 25th with a lovely signed book waiting under the tree. If you need any help getting a signed copy, send me a message and I'm sure we can sort something out. And on that note, it just leaves me to say thank you very much for listening. Diolch yn fawr iawn am wrando. I've been Mark Rees. This has been my Ghosts and Folklore podcast, beaming to you from Wales to the world. And remember, if you do find yourself lost in a graveyard this winter season, flitting from grave to grave, and maybe, just maybe, you hear a sound in the distance, if it sounds anything like Wallach, get the heck out of there. Until next time, Nosta!